We have been thrown a curveball this morning, and so it stands to reason that I would throw a curveball back. Instead of beginning our new series entitled The Mystery of Godliness, I'm going to go back and look at something that we find Paul sharing with us. It is found in 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. The premise of what I want to share with you builds upon this thought. If you knew that today would be your very last day on earth, and that you would be given the opportunity to rehearse your life, to kind of go back and think about the things that you did and the things that you did not do, to think about the things that brought great rejoicing and also the things that would bring great regret. If you had that opportunity to assess your life against the backdrop of knowing that, hey, today I'm going to experience a transition. I'm moving today from time into eternity. If you had that knowledge and that opportunity, what would be your testimony? How would you sum up your life? Paul is facing death. He knows that the sentence has been passed. He sits there in the Mamertine prison. He knows at any time the guards can come and pull him from the dungeon and put his feet on the path to take him outside the city and there be executed. Now you would kind of think that if you were in that situation, that you would be wringing your hands, that you might be even trying to bargain with God, plead your case, why God needs to deliver you, why you need to have the opportunity to live for another day. I mean, at a moment like this, you could only imagine the emotions that would go through a person's mind. You know what is about to happen. And added to that, you have the opportunity to think back past your life that you have lived. How would you sum up your life? Would there be a spirit of rejoicing? Or would there be the spirit of regret? Paul sets before us an incredible challenge. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, he's coming down to the last chapter. This is it. Many times we refer to 2 Timothy as Paul's last will and testament. So here he is, as I have described. He knows that his time is up, that he is facing death, And he has that moment to think back upon his life. He writes these words, and only a person filled with and led by the Spirit of God could write such words as Paul writes. He begins in verse 6, 2 Timothy chapter 4. They are familiar verses to many of us. But there's some things about what Paul says that I want to point out that may be new to your thinking. In 2 Timothy 4, beginning verse 6, Paul writes, "For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing." In these 3 verses, we are reading Paul's last testimony concerning the life that he is now looking back upon. He shares with us some very insightful thoughts. The first thought he shares is this. He shares with us his future. He shares with us his future. Look at verse 6. He says, "For I am now ready to be offered." Literally, as a drink offering. My life is about to be poured out. Now, when we come to death, the first thing that we think is this: well, this is the end. But not so for Paul. Paul did not see his approaching death as an end, but rather as a new beginning, because he knew that death was but a doorway to his future. Note what he says. He says, "I'm now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure." Note, he does not say the time of my death is at hand. He declares the time of my departure is at hand. This is a beautiful word. It means literally to set sail, to pull up anchor. He says, I'm about to embark on the greatest journey of my life. Now, let me remind you that if anybody knew about a journey, Paul did. As you go to the book of Acts, he had 3 missionary journeys. So he knew what it was to travel. He knew what it was to go from one destination to another destination. And that's what he's saying as he's looking death in the face. He says, I want you to know something. This is not my end. This is but my departure. This is the beginning of my future. Remember what Paul had stated earlier? He says this, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord." Now, we would look at Paul and we would maybe ask, well, Paul, are you not afraid? Well, listen to his words. He doesn't even acknowledge death as being death. He calls death a departure. That's amazing. What confidence, what strength, what boldness. So Paul, as he gives to us his last testimony, he begins by sharing his future. But then he moves on and he shares with us a second thing. He says, for I have fought a good fight. His fight. His fight. Now, Paul knew as he looked back upon his life that he had served the Lord from the moment of his salvation and his calling. He had served the Lord with the realization that he would serve the Lord on a battlefield, not a playground. Too many of us are playing at what God has called us to do. You want to know how real the enemy is? Serve Jesus and you'll find out. How often Paul would tell us about his sufferings. How often Paul would remind us that there were places he wanted to go to, but he was hindered. He was held back. By what? By the enemy. And even when he went to those places that he wanted to go to, he was met with tremendous opposition. How many times would Paul go to a place and then have to leave? Not because he wanted to. He had to leave to save his life. And so Paul says, my future, I am making this departure from earth to heaven, from time to eternity. It's now going to be reality. But not only does he tell us about his future and his fight, he tells us a third thing. He tells us about his finish. Now, I like this. Having said, I have fought a good fight, he then goes on and he says this, I have finished my course. The average Christian today has no inkling of an idea as to what God wants for their life. If someone came to you and gave you a piece of paper and a pencil and asked you to write on that paper what is God's will for your life, what would you write? What would you write? See, the average Christian, they start off with a very bad image of what it means to be saved. And I pound this into the minds of those who I get the opportunity to speak to. So many have gotten the idea that once you come to salvation, you've crossed the finish line. And you are absolutely, positively wrong. The moment you are saved, you have not crossed the finish line. You have just gotten out of the starter's box. And there's a path. We call it the will of God. And that path is a path designed for you by God, and only you can fulfill God's calling, God's will for your life. No one else can do that for you. You must do that for yourself. It's God's will for you. Now, God doesn't have a blanket will where it just catches everybody. No, God's will is customized. And if you are going to finish the course, it stands to reason that you must begin the course. You must know what path it is that God has put your feet on, and then stay on that path, no matter what the condition of the path may be. Sometimes the path is well lit. Sometimes the path is rather dark and gloomy. Sometimes the path is straight, but sometimes the path is crooked. Sometimes the path is really smooth. At other times the path is full of potholes. But no matter the condition of the path, put your feet on it and stay the course. And like Paul, you can look back upon your life and say, I have finished my course. So Paul tells us in his last testimony about his future. He tells us about his fight. He tells us about his finish. But he also tells us about his faith. Verse 7, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Now what is it that he tells us about his faith? He tells us this, I've been faithful in my faith. I have been faithful in my faith. Many who have come to faith have yet to establish a faithfulness to the faith they have come to. You know, I always rejoice about those who come in, but I can't help to think about those who went out the back door. Think about the people who have come to receive Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. There was that moment where they were excited. There was that moment when they were so filled with the joy of the Lord that they would be willing to charge hell with a water pistol if they had the opportunity. Man, they were ready to serve Jesus. But time and circumstances began to take its toll. You know, the problem is so many in the church today have been saved for so long that they have forgotten what it was like BC, before Christ. I never want to forget what my life was like before I met Jesus. I never want to forget where I was headed without Jesus. I know. It burns in my mind and in my heart. I know what He has saved me from, and I know what He saved me for. See, many people, they come to understand what God has saved them from, but they never come to understand what God has saved them for. I'll never forget when I began to feel the tug of God upon my life to go into ministry. I fought God. I thought God was making the biggest mistake He'd ever made. Lord, you know my background. You know how I grew up. Lord, you know the path that I was about to embark upon. And because of that particular path, I wanted to go in the opposite direction. I really wanted to become an FBI agent. I really did. And in my senior year, or actually my junior year, going into my senior year, back when the FBI headquarters was over on Paulson, I went through all the things that you had to do and got my paperwork and did all the exams and everything. And so I was ready to go upon my graduation until I got a call. They turned me down. It wasn't because I failed anything. It's because they had a standard at that particular time that an FBI man out in the field had to be at least 6 feet tall. It wasn't fair. And as you can see clearly, I never made that requirement. God has a way of taking our plans and changing them, redirecting us, bringing us to the place where we need to see His plan. And you know what? His plan is better than my plan ever was. I look back on those days and I see how God worked in my life. He was my encourager. To this day, people who knew me back then, they'll ask the silly question. First of all, they don't believe that I'm doing what I'm doing because they knew me back then. But then they'll say something like this, are you still doing that preaching thing? I like that preaching thing. And you know, I got so tired trying to explain that to them, so I just came back with a silly response, only on the weekends. Paul says, I have come to the faith. I know what He saved me from, but I have become faithful to the faith, and now I know what He saved me for. The amazing thing is this, and I still have a hard time putting it together. The fact that God would not just save me, but He would choose to use me. He would choose to use me. I'm humbled by that. So Paul tells us in his last testimony, he tells us about his future, tells us about his fight, tells us about his finish, tells us about his faith. How do you end with that kind of testimony? Well, you can only end it with one thing. Now he tells us about his favor. Look at verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love His appearing. Man, you talk about the favor of God. Paul knew that he had run to win the prize. He talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He uses the image of the athlete. He says, don't you realize that they all run, but only one wins the prize? So he writes to the Corinthians, he says, if you're going to run with the ambition, run with the intention, run with the determination that at the end of the race, you've won the prize. You've won the favor of God. See, Paul had already talked about the fact back in chapter 2. He said this in verse 11 and 12. It is a faithful saying, for if we be dead with Him, we shall also live with Him. If we suffer, we shall also reign with Him. If we deny Him, He will also deny us. Paul said he did not want to stand before the Lord receiving God's disfavor. He wanted to stand before the Lord having God's favor. He wanted to hear those words that Jesus utters. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. So think about this. You know it's your last day here on earth. You have the presence of mind to look back on the life that you have lived. If God were to give you pencil and paper, what would you write?